And thank you for coming out on a snowy night, and we're glad to see Jane all recovered and back with us.
Thanks for waiting for me. I apologize.
Before we get to our program and the Babe Ruth story, such a distinguished audience, a lot of good friends that I've reacquainted with tonight. One person who we just met this evening that I'd like to single out and introduce. Arguably, the best Babe Ruth movie ever made was the Babe Ruth story starring William Bendix. And how's that as a way of...
That's excellent, Marty.
Mary Ann Carlo, William Bendix's niece, is here with us tonight. Can you stand? What a treat that was to meet Mary Ann.
Everywhere I go, there's always somebody who pops out of the audience that, I have not yet had somebody come and say they slept with Babe Ruth, but pretty close. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This month, December, marks 26th. The 100th anniversary of the sale of Babe Ruth from Boston to New York. And boy, did that change baseball history just a little bit. Harry Frazee, the owner of the Red Sox, lived in New York, even though he owned the Red Sox. He was a theater mogul, and he produced shows on Broadway.
Far. He wasn't exactly a mogul, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So he and Jacob Ruppert met in December of 1919 and conjured up this little transaction that really changed everything about baseball going forward. So it's appropriate that we're sort of celebrating this 100th anniversary together. And Jane, I was thinking as I was coming over here, in most sports, I'm thinking Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan and maybe Tom Brady. In most sports, we tend to think the greatest we've ever seen, we've actually seen them. They're contemporary figures, Muhammad Ali. Yet in baseball, Babe Ruth endures, somebody that none of us ever saw perform except for a few seconds on newsreel. And yet he remains, by consensus certainly, the greatest baseball player there ever was. You agree with that?
Absolutely. My friend and yours, Dan Okrent, the guy who created Rotisserie League, Fantasy League baseball, but managed never to make a cent off of it, once said of Babe Ruth, he was Beethoven and Cezanne. And that's because he was both the best left-handed pitcher in the major leagues when he played for the Boston Red Sox, starting briefly in 1914 and then through 1919. And then all he did was reinvent the game of baseball. He literally took the ball and the strategy and the entire way of playing the game out of the hands of micromanagers like John McGraw, for example, who managed the Giants and basically moved men around the bases like chess pieces. And Babe Ruth was an impatient guy, didn't have exactly a long attention span, and why should I do that? Why should I choke up and play small ball, hit the ball to left field, move a guy from first to second, when I can take one swing and put everybody out of their misery? And so he basically, literally, took the game into his own hands and reinvented it. And that's rare in sports. We can think of maybe 5 or 6 guys, Jimmy Connors turning a return of serve into a weapon, Bill Russell becoming the force in the NBA by redefining how to play the center position and causing defense to suddenly matter as much as offense. And so Babe Ruth, the game you see today, except for the thwacks and all the sound and the percussion that we've now attached to it, Babe Ruth created the game that you see today. He literally knew how to swing a bat the way Mickey Mantle swings a bat, the way Bryce Harper swings a bat. He knew how to employ the principles of leverage and torque and to turn his hips away from the pitcher and then swing all the way through a ball in order to create distance and power. And so, yeah, he is still the best player ever.
I've had people ask me over the years, well, these are manly men with muscles and athleticism. Didn't they all want to hit the ball over the fence? And I would say to them, you know what? Take a throw pillow off your sofa and hit it as far as you can. And soon you get the idea, no, I can't really hit it that far. I'm going to have to learn to just place it and move the runners around like that. So when Babe Ruth started hitting home runs, he was really hitting a dead ball still, right?
Sure, he was hitting a dead ball that did not have the bouncy interior core that is now played with. And a lot of you probably know from this fall and from this year that people think they changed the ball, and that's why there were so many home runs hit this year. But yes, it was a dead ball, and it was often a mud ball. They didn't have hundreds of balls to give away and, you know, goes into the stand, fine. You know, they kept using the same ball over and over again. So by the middle or end of a game, it was a mess. But by the same token, you know, here was a guy, to give you a sense of the lack of power before Babe Ruth and after Babe Ruth, in 1918, there were 135 home runs total hit in Major League Baseball. 11 of them were hit by Babe Ruth. 1 was given up by Babe Ruth, the left-handed pitcher. So the number, I had a great economist help me with this, more people in the United States would have been lucky to know a survivor of the sinking of the Titanic than to have seen a home run in 1918. So flash forward to today where that's all anybody swings for, much, I would say, to the detriment of the game. But he completely changed it from a nice little, you know, commuting from base to base kind of game to one of physics, and one in which players took the responsibility and the power away from the managers, which is one reason managers didn't like him.
And not everybody was in love with home runs when he was hitting them in Boston, and some people were happy to see him go because that's not the way you're supposed to play baseball,
Precisely.
Right?
All of his managers, for example. But, you know, the thing about the trade, the sale of Babe Ruth, which occurred on December 26, 1919, not reported until after New Year's that year. He was sold for $100,000. Erroneously reported in the New York Times paper of record as $125,000. The deal called for Babe Ruth to come to New York, at which point Rupert immediately doubled his salary. And Harry Frazee was so bad at negotiating that Rupert actually got Frazee to pay half the increase of Babe Ruth's salary. But worse than that, on the $100,000, Frazee had to pay 7% interest. And the payments were made 4 years, $25,000. But he was so broke, and it was not to produce No No Nanette, by the way. That actually was not produced till a couple of years later. He was so broke that he also borrowed $300,000 from Jake Rupert. And he paid 7% interest on that $300,000 loan and gave Jake Rupert as collateral the deed to Fenway Park. So what happened? You guys probably do math a lot better than I. At the end of 6 years, Harry Frazee had paid Jake Rupert more in interest than he paid him for Babe Ruth. In short, he paid to take Babe Ruth off his hands. That's how bad a deal it was.
It was the original Bobby Bonilla deal, I think. I just want to back up a minute, because when it was announced that you were doing the Babe Ruth book,
Yeah.
I had a friend who said to me, do we
Why?
really need another Babe Ruth book? And I thought about it, and my response was, this is a great thing for America, because it's like we get a new Lincoln book every few years.
I would say
And
every
it's-
year, maybe.
And it's great that we keep the story going. Plus, with your skills, you were going to find, undoubtedly, things that hadn't been reported before.
sport.
Because Jane, I'm going to embarrass her here, but she's really become one of the preeminent American biographers, not just in sports, but in American literature. So you met your task, you came through. And tell us a little bit about the process, where you traveled, who you met, particularly people from way back.
Yeah, the Altacacas, yeah, okay.
Yeah. You didn't meet William Bendix, we know that.
I did not meet William Bendix. I did meet one of Babe Ruth's bat boys who helped him out on part of the tour that he took that the book is based on, but I'll explain that in a minute. I didn't want to write this book, okay? I thought it was crazy, and I kept asking the publisher if I could do other things, and they kept rejecting the ideas. I said, Billie Jean King, and they said, she's too old. And I said, well, Babe Ruth's older, and he's dead. And they said, I said, what you're really trying to say is she's gay, right? And you don't want me to write about a gay tennis player. And basically, that was the truth. And then I suggested Mel Brooks. I had an in with Mel Brooks. I was gonna sit and do Mel Brooks. What a way to spend a year or so, right? They said, he's too old. I went, So finally, I realized that because of the success of my book on Sandy Koufax and the one on Mickey Mantle, that all they wanted me to write about was baseball. And that's kind of like having, a golden manacle around you. A lot of writers these days can't get contracts at all, so I'm very lucky in that sense. But all they wanted from me was baseball, and they wanted Babe Ruth. And I said, that's nuts, because so much had been written, and it's all really good. They're very different kinds of biographies, and they've been written over a long period of time, but Bob Creamer's book, published in '74, Marshall Smeltzer, '75, Lee Montville, 2010, Tom Meany earlier in the 50s, I think. They're all really good, and they all are different kinds of biographies, but biographies in sports have always been sort of a subgenre, where you were really telling the story of an athletic career, not of a life. And so what I did is I sat down and read all of them. That's why I can say they're good. And what struck me forcibly was that the first 20 years of his life were completely missing from every single book. Now, if you tried to write a biography of Winston Churchill and had nothing about him before the age of 20, you'd be laughed out of the Library of Congress, right? But in sports, you could always get away with that. So with that absence in each of the prior biographies, I thought, okay, there's a story to tell. And usually when there's a story to tell that hasn't been told and it's missing everywhere, there's a reason. That's, reporter BS detector. There's something going on. So I did, Marty knew Julia Ruth Stevens, Babe's daughter, who died last March at age 102. And what you do in reporting, and it sounds kind of, cynical, but you go to the old people first, because you never know how long they're going to be around. So I went and introduced myself and interviewed Julia at great length, lovely, lovely woman, in 2011. So it really did take 8 years to write this. And apropos of nothing, and this is the kind of luck that happens in reporting, she leaned forward, and she was very ladylike and very pert, and she affected a Southern accent, though she never lived in the South. Her mother had. And she said very discreetly, you do know that Kate and George, that's Babe's parents, that they were separated. And she whispered the word separated. And my jaw dropped, and I went, no, I did not know that, and neither did anybody else. Babe Ruth didn't want anybody to know that. So what did I do? I called one of his granddaughters, lovely woman, Donna Anilovich. I said, Julia says that Kate and Georgia were separated. She goes, hell no, they were divorced. So this is how you report a book about a dead person in 2018, 19, whatever this is. You go to the archives, because book writing and reporting have changed radically. The difference between what Lee Montville was able to do in 2010, writing about Babe, and me over a period from 2011 to 2018, is the availability of digital collections of both newspapers and family archives. So you don't have to be a genius. How many lawyers do we have in here? Just a few, okay. You don't have to be a genius to go to Google and type in George H. Ruth Sr. v. Katie Ruth, and what shows up? A 150-page dossier on one of the ugliest divorces you're ever going to want to know about. And suddenly, like that, the light bulb goes on, and I go, now I know why he never wanted to talk about his parents. Now I know why he never wanted to talk about his childhood. And from there, once I had that story and had that fact, that's when I signed the contract to do the book. I wouldn't sign the contract before that. And the story of this lost boy who was known in his family as Little George, and how he became this big fella had never been told. And if you're a writer, you don't want to rewrite what's already been done. That's called a clip job. It's no fun, right? So I set out to try to write the story of Babe Ruth that had never been written before. And the slideshow Marty and I have put together for you is picked, as was the cover of this book, because each image, and there's some video that nobody's ever seen before mixed in with this, each image shows something about him that's never been seen before, and which I tried to explicate throughout the book. Should we start with that, or is there something else?
I just wanted to follow up for a second on, divorce was much more rare at the turn of the century, and they were both Catholic, right?
No.
No.
She was Catholic, and he was Lutheran. George's grandfather had converted into a kind of crazy Lutheran sect in Baltimore, and in fact, Kate had to sneak Babe out to a local parish to get him baptized because George hated Catholics so much, eventually including his wife, I might add, that he had to pretend that it never happened, and none of the other children were baptized.
Okay. Let's do the slideshow.
Okay, all right, we can elaborate.
Yeah, we'll interrupt with some discussion points as we go through it, and you'll control changing the slides.
Always, Marty.
Okay.
Always. So this picture was taken at the Polo Grounds. You can't really tell the original. You can tell that he's sitting in the dirt of the infield. They did magic at the publisher and honed in on his face and his body in such a way that you don't see what I liked partly about it, which is the loneliness of him. It's just him in this gigantic, open, empty space. Also, the original image was flipped the other way, and the reason it was changed, this is inside publishing dirt, was because in order to have Barnes & Noble and Walmart and all the other places put their sticker, they said his face has to be on the other side or our sticker's going to go in the middle of his nose. And surprisingly, the estate of the photographer, who was a guy named Nicholas Murray, agreed. I was astonished that they agreed.
But how did the NY come out, not flipped?
Oh, they flipped it.
Okay.
They redrew it. So the photographer was a guy named Nicholas Murray, who was a very early fashion and celebrity photographer. He's most known probably for the zillion images he took of Frida Kahlo, with whom he had a 9-year affair after taking her portrait. He was also a fencer and died in a fencing accident. But he goes to take these pictures of Babe Ruth.
I want to hear more about the fencing accident.
I don't have a picture of it. Unlike every other photographer that early, he wasn't interested in or trying to capture Babe Ruth in action. You can see that this is a guy who's trying to get at the personality. It's personality journalism in the early 20s. And what I love about the picture is several things. First of all, can you see his hand? I also was kind of mad at the publisher because they kept making the big fella bigger and bigger. And I really wanted you to be able to see not just the size of that hand, which is gigantic, but also the way he's holding himself. This is a defensive, I don't really want anybody to get too close to me posture. And it's also those eyes looking out, like it's a dare. You think you're going to get me? You're not. And there actually was a bat between his legs and it stuck up in a really bizarre way. So they colored that out also.
Now,
But
he was an enormous celebrity almost from the day he arrived in New York. He was famous in Boston as a star pitcher, and he'd been in the World Series.
Right.
But his arrival in New York was enormous.
well, Babe Ruth's arrival in New York for the 1920 season coincided with many important economic and cultural shifts. It's the end of World War I, and while there's a depression for a while, there's also the beginning of consumer economy. And the money that had been used to fund a wartime, production of arms and armaments, some had to go somewhere else, and they're reconverting factories into consumer goods. And so you're going to need somebody to persuade people that they need to buy the products that they never knew they needed. Suddenly there are refrigerators to buy, and radio sets to buy, and vacuum cleaners to buy. Well, how do you know you need a vacuum cleaner if you don't even know what a vacuum cleaner is? And the answer to that is marketing and public relations, which was being developed on Madison Avenue here by Ivy Lee, who represented the Pennsylvania Railroad, et cetera, and Edward Bernays, who represented
Who I met.
everybody else. Did you really?
He lived a long life, and he taught a seminar on public relations. This would have been in the 1980s, and I took the course from him. I was taught by Edward Bernays. How about that?
Who never played a day of sports in his life. He was a caddy on Long Island on a golf course once, and that was it. His daughter lives near me at Cape Cod. Anyway, Bernays was a genius, and he knew whether it was a political candidate that he was trying to sell, or war bonds that he was trying to sell, because that's where he got his training, or ivory soap, and he created a soap carving competition, or cigarettes, where he staged a parade on Fifth Avenue with women smoking their Lucky Strikes, and he reconfigured smoking as not something indelicate, but a declaration of independence for women. So this is a guy who, and he actually got into doing sports stuff later for sporting goods.
I remember him teaching us in the 80s statistics and research. That's what the journalists love. Even if you make it up, they love numbers.
They love it, right, exactly. And he made up a lot of it, particularly when he was representing the beer consortium, in which he dealt with, guess who? Jacob Rupert, but who was the head of it for a while. So what did they need? They needed a personality to sell the goods. And here comes Babe Ruth with the most memorable body shape and face that anybody had ever seen. And so the idea of associating a product and saying, I want to be like Babe Ruth, so I'm going to chew his gum. I want to be like Babe Ruth, so I'm going to get my kid his baseball glove. I want to be like Babe Ruth, so I'm going to eat his ice cream, because we all know he ate too much, right? And this is the beginning of a huge cultural shift into the creation of celebrity culture. And as Roger Angell, and you all know Roger Angell is a great baseball writer for the New Yorker, said he was the model for modern celebrity. And he had, well, let's see, do we want to do that stuff now, or do we want to go, yeah, okay, let's. So here he is. I just chose to do the book in order to make it different from everything else. I didn't want to do birth to death. That's boring. Everybody is born, everybody dies, right? So I decided to recreate a barnstorming trip that he took with Lou Gehrig in the fall of 1927. It's 12 days after he hits his 60th home run and runs around the bases at Yankee Stadium crowing 60, count 'em 60, let's see some other son of a bitch do that. And it's 2 days after the Yankees sweep the Pirates in the 27 World Series, with Babe Ruth hitting the only 2 home runs. And he's going to set off on a 3-week tour of America with Lou Gehrig in tow, which is set up by, and I'm not sure, can you see Christy Walsh Management on the bottom?
Yeah.
Set up by the guy who represented both Babe and Lou, Christy Walsh, who was the first sports agent. He's the real Jerry Maguire. He was the guy who who took all of the ideas of Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays and employed them to make Babe Ruth money. And what you see people doing today for LeBron, et cetera, is exactly the same model, just with many, many more dollar signs and, decimal points. But in 1927, when Babe Ruth earned $70,000 for playing for the Yankees, the first of a 3-year contract, which he earned $70,000 a year, he earned more than that from his off-the-field activities. And that meant barnstorming, that meant vaudeville, it meant product endorsements, going on the radio. Are you kidding me? The radio, suddenly? He got paid for doing that. And that is transformative. And they understood, Walsh and Ruth, that a player ought to be paid not just for the balls he hit out of the stadium, but for the tushies they brought into the stadium. And again, that's a radical repositioning and of how to see and pay for athletes. So there they go.
So Babe was a very rich man.
Oh.
And really never squandered the money, didn't lose the money.
Yeah, he did. Christy had to save his tuchus.
In the 30s?
No, in the 20s.
In the 20s, okay.
In the 20s. I guess I better explain that. Babe Ruth was an inveterate gambler. He was a huge tipper. He was a big, big spender. This goes back to his childhood where he had nothing. And the old trope is that as soon as he got out of the school that he was sent to by his parents, and I'm jumping ahead here, I realize that, he tried to fill himself up with everything that he could get his hands on. Women, booze, food, consumer delicacies. And so he was so broke in 1925 that he had to borrow money from Christy Walsh, and basically to pay his taxes. And so Walsh said, yes, I'll give you the money, but you have to sign this contract saying you will never again buy any real estate or make any other deal without my say-so. It's at that point in 25 that he becomes not just his agent for making him money, but he gets control of his entire financial life and turned it around so that by 27, he was not only not in the red anymore, but he was making, like I said, 74 from the Yankees and 73 off the field, which in 2016 dollars was $26 million.
Would you say that perhaps only the president and Charlie Chaplin were more famous in his time?
Oh, everybody thought he was more famous than the president, that's for sure. I like to say that he was the most famous man in America who wanted to be famous. Charlie Chaplin was not an American, as we all know, and he was embroiled in a scandal over liking young girls. I mean, you could have said the same thing about the Babe, but Charlie was in trouble for it. And Lindbergh, of course, who was every bit as famous, didn't want to be. Lindbergh was more comfortable being up in his plane, away from the sweaty, earthbound glad-handing that Babe loved to do. So I think he was the most famous man who wanted to be famous and therefore was willing to do anything to be famous. The picture of him posing with a gigantic lobster on National Lobster Day was also, I'm sorry, it's not in this collection, but it's great.
Okay, give it a click.
Okay. There he is at 3 years old.
So cute.
And this picture is important. First of all, it's signed to somebody who says, I can't even read it anymore, but see this cute little boy. Say that again? What a nice little boy at age 3, and now wow, I think is what it says. But now wow. So what's important about this is if I asked you, and I'm going to, how many people have heard that he was born poor and grew up running amok on the Baltimore waterfront? How many poor kids, get portraits taken like that at age 3? Lots of times images give you the clues that you can't find actually in other kinds of written archives. You got to be pretty rich to have a kid sit for a portrait like that. And that was one of the first clues that the story what the received wisdom, that he was poor, that his poor, hardworking parents couldn't take care of him or his siblings, was not true. So here we go. They're the poor, hardworking parents dressed up for a family reunion. They don't look so poor to me. And in fact, they weren't. But in 1902, June 13th, 1902, George Sr. decided to send his son away to an institution called the St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys. Needless to say, you don't have to say white boys, but it was all white boys. They took orphans, they took abandoned boys, they took what were called wayward boys, and they took incorrigible boys. And the reason George Sr. sent him away was the marriage of Kate and Ruth was already incredibly destructive. They had, she gave birth to 8 kids, only 2 survived. Of the 4 that I could identify in archives, 4 died in infancy. And of those 4, 2 died of malnutrition. And one of those children had just died. And the old trope is that George was sent away, little George was sent away to this school because he was a bad kid and ran amok on the waterfront. In fact, he was sent away because his parents' marriage was falling apart, because his mother was an alcoholic and was trading sexual favors with George's bartenders for alcohol.
George Sr.
George Sr., yes. And because children were dying one after another. So by the time Babe Ruth is sent away to this school, he's already seen the death of 3 infant siblings. And the school took, in addition to orphans and abandoned kids, they also took boarding students. What was Babe Ruth? He was a boarding student. His father paid $15 a month for him to go there. That's a whole lot of money in 1902. And it's another clue that the story that has been handed down and that he allowed to prosper and take root in the absence of fact was preferable to him than telling the truth.
What about his sister? What was her upbringing?
The only other surviving sibling was named Mary Margaret. She was born 6 years after Babe Ruth. She was born in 1900. And her twin sister was one of the children who died. And basically, she didn't know him. Basically, they weren't raised together, and yet she became, de facto, the expert on the family history. And so she would always tell the story that, oh yes, George had to be sent away to St. Mary's because he wouldn't go to school, because he was a truant. Well, guess what? In June 1902, when he was first sent there, everybody was getting out of school. There was no way to be a truant in June. So all the assumptions that people have made and the conclusions people drew, one by one, they all disintegrated. So this is a dorm at St. Mary's. And the boys slept together, head to toe, in perfectly aligned rows of wrought iron cots.
You mean two in a bed?
No.
When you say head to toe?
No, the beds are aligned head to toe.
Okay.
And there's just enough room between the beds for a bentwood chair and to get down on your hands and knees and say your prayers. St. Mary's was overcrowded, to say the least. Dorm rooms that were meant to house 90 often had 130 kids. Kids were, left lying around in beds in the halls a lot of times. They had 6 cents a day to feed each child. That's it. And they were doing God's work. It was non-denominational. who's the guy who went there? Blah, 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 blah. The Jewish comedian, I'm blocking his name. It was a Jewish comedian who went there. It'll come to me in a second. But what there wasn't were any amenities. There's not a single personal item at any bed. What you're looking at is life in a public institution, where what Babe Ruth learned by sleeping with the same kids, by going to the bathroom with the same kids, by eating with the same kids, and that was in silence, by the way, and by playing baseball with the same kids, what he learned was how to be public. And so when you look at the celebrity he became, and this was the big aha for me, it was inherent in him. This was what this guy needed. He needed to be around men and boys. He needed to be surrounded the way he was as a child. That's where he was most comfortable. His second wife, Claire, would say later the one thing he couldn't do was be alone. And at the end of his career, when he was very alone and Major League Baseball found no use for him, he was, his daughter, the deceased daughter, Dorothy, said, suicidal. And there he is, surrounded by men and boys. That was taken, I think that's my favorite picture of him, that was taken in August 1925 after an exhibition game in Syracuse, because major league teams played games on off days to raise money, and it was part of Babe's contract that he got paid extra to play in every exhibition game. So 5,000 kids are trying to cram themselves into this one image, and they want to touch him, and that's okay with him. There's no posse to protect him. They want to be near him. They want to be seen being near him. This is almost a landmark of modern photography, because what you're looking at is kids who are not looking at him. They want to be seen being with him. This is the beginning of me photography. So if you notice, there's only one little boy. He's in the corner, and he's wearing an egregious beanie. His mother obviously dressed him really badly, and he's looking back at the Babe. Everybody else is looking at the camera. And there's one little girl on the shoulders, somebody over towards the right of the frame, and she has exactly the haircut my mother gave me when I was in third grade.
Now, he was already Babe Ruth here. It was 1925,
Right. And look,
he was at the top of his celebrity.
He's gridlocked in a clot of joy. This is the happiest you will ever see this man.
And we always hear that he loved kids, so there was no myth to that, right?
No,
That was
he really
genuine.
did. Sometimes he could get impatient, but this is where he was most comfortable in his own skin. These are the kids who would have been at St. Mary's with him. The same age, they loved baseball, and they loved him.
Same hats.
Yeah, same hats. Yeah, the newsy hats.
St. Mary's still standing?
St. Mary's is on the cusp, the western edge of Baltimore City. It became a private Catholic high school after it closed in '51, when it suddenly became apparent to the legislators in Maryland that this quasi-public private religious school violated separation of church and state. And so they closed it in 1951, and it became a private Catholic high school, which then closed about 10, 15 years ago. Cal Ripken and his foundation rescued the field, and the field has now been repurposed, in that lovely word of the present. You can go play baseball on Babe Ruth's old field. They also have, lines for soccer and everything else, but it is preserved. It's still in one of the lousiest parts of Baltimore. But of course, when Babe Ruth was there, it was pastoral. It was, 3 miles from downtown. It was forever away from where he grew up and everything he knew.
I wanted to ask you before you click to the next one. So you went there, you presumably saw the grounds and saw the building. Where else did your travels take you in the process of doing this?
Oh boy. So because I decided to recreate this tour, and the tour had 21 cities, I went to as many of them as I could. So they started, they were supposed to play, believe it or not, this is the difference between modern day baseball and what was. The World Series finished very fast, and nobody expected it to, four straight. And so Christy Walsh, the agent, scheduled a doubleheader at the Hebrew home for the Sunday against a Negro League team as a way of making money, because that's what Christy Walsh was good at. But it was rained out, so they didn't play on Sunday. So then there's basically a competition to see who's going to get them on Monday. And originally they were going to go to Springfield, but at the last minute Providence outbid them. So they started their tour in Providence, Rhode Island, where Babe Ruth had played and helped the Providence Grays win a championship, minor league championship in 1914, when he was a great left-handed pitcher. And then they went to Trenton, where Babe Ruth was, he literally, and this happened a lot, as he was rounding the bases for his third home run of the day, off Dick Redding, the great Negro League pitcher who was near the end of his career, but still could throw pretty hard. Kids were holding on to his arms, and as he ran around the bases, they were holding on to his arms, holding on to his bat, and he came back into the dugout where he landed basically in the lap of the mayor of Trenton, who hadn't been to a baseball game in 30 years, but was sitting there because he was somehow hoping Babe Ruth would come to spend Halloween in Trenton, which wasn't going to happen. But Babe Ruth said, God, I was really scared that, one of my spikes, because I was really wearing spikes, that I was gonna kill one of these kids because they just, attached themselves to him. So I went to Trenton, and that field still exists. Then I went to the stadium, the site of the ballpark in Brooklyn, which no longer exists. However, there is the same subway stop and the same cemetery. You can sort of see where the field was. Then Asbury Park, I went to Asbury Park. I did not go to Lima, Ohio. I skipped it. I did go to Kansas City. I did go to Denver. I skipped Sioux City. I skipped Omaha.
So this was the Jane tour.
This was the Jane tour.
Right.
And then I went to all the California places.
Okay. Click.
Okay. Oops, sorry. So back to Christy Walsh. Christy Walsh was a genius. Christy Walsh set up an event on the field where Charles Lindbergh would take off 10 months later on Long Island, and he created a record for Babe Ruth to break. The record was who would catch the ball tossed from an airplane at the greatest height. Now, of course, nobody had ever caught a ball tossed from an airplane.
But this was Bernays saying people love statistics.
People love
Give 'em
statistics,
numbers.
give them numbers. So he has this, biplane go up, and first it goes up to 1,000 feet, and Babe Ruth is running all over the field. This is July 1926, and what you can't see, the propellers kicked up so much dust, and it was 100 degrees out, that the barracks, which are actually right behind Babe Ruth, can't be seen. There's another picture that shows him really clearly. And he's wearing a woolen military uniform because Christy Walsh is going to align him with every military cause he can find, partly because, again, it's good PR, and partly because Babe Ruth had been accused of being a draft dodger during World War I, and there was an FBI file on him that they didn't want to become public, but he also wanted to inoculate him against that bad PR if it ever became public. So he introduced him to Pershing, and he got him to be a representative for civilian training camps for kids. And he would sign bats for all these kids. And on this particular day, he was supposed to catch a baseball. And the pilot finally had to come down to 300 feet, and he caught one the seventh one from 300 feet. The guy who was representing the Army Air Force was laughing hysterically through the entire thing that Christy Walsh set this up. But guess what? There were newsreel cameras there, and it appeared on the front page of the New York Daily News and the New York Times.
And by the way,
Yes.
you talked about signing bats. If any of you have ever seen any auction catalogs and so forth, a Babe Ruth signed baseball, particularly if he's the only signature on it, goes for thousands and thousands of dollars. And the irony of that is nobody signed as many baseballs as Babe Ruth did.
Or Pete Sheehy.
Well, the Yankee clubhouse man signed a lot too.
Right.
But it's amazing. I mean, he made a deal later in his life with Ford Motor Company or something, where test drive a Ford, get a Babe Ruth baseball. There were so many of these out there, and now somehow they've become scarce.
Dealers of sports memorabilia who are not notably the most straightforward guys in the world will tell you that he's the gold standard. Everything else in sports memorabilia is pretty much tanked, except for Babe Ruth and Mickey Mantle. And by the way, Sandy Koufax's signature now goes higher because of my book, which she doesn't acknowledge. Okay. So there's the Babe as the great left-handed pitcher. He was known as the Baltimore Blizzard, who threw shooters. He held a record for most consecutive scoreless innings in World Series play that was not equaled or broken until Whitey Ford did it in
the same year that Roger Maris broke
61.
the home run record. 61 was a bad year for the Babe.
I knew you would know that. But look at the balance. Look at the balance of him. And look how he's not fat. When he got to Boston, he was 6'2" and 185 or 190 pounds. He hadn't yet indulged in the amount of beer that would later amplify his middle.
Was he Babe in Baltimore or not till Boston?
No, he became Babe in Baltimore, supposedly on the first day of spring training when somebody saw him in Fayetteville and said, "Oh, there goes Jack Dunn's new Babe." Jack Dunn was the owner of the Baltimore Orioles and what league was that?
International League.
Thank you, International League. And that's supposedly how he got his name. And here is Babe Ruth breaking his 1920 record for 29 home runs. So this is his 30th home run. And what's significant about this is not just is there a revolution in marketing and public relations, there's a revolution in newspapering. You know, when people talk about the golden era of sports, what they're really talking about is the golden era of sports writing and journalism. So the New York Daily News goes to print for the first time in July of 1919, and maybe it was the end of June 26th, sorry. And the first sports cover is a fight on July 2nd. And here comes Babe Ruth, who is made for the front page. So much so that in the fall of 1919, the original editor decided to create what's known throughout journalism as the back page, a front page for sports. And Babe Ruth would fill that with his prodigious clouts for the next 14 years. And Christy Walsh would find every occasion. That's him with Jack Dempsey after Jack Dempsey's fight. And there are other ones where they're standing back to back and you can't tell whose body is whose, because Babe was pretty much as trim and as strong as Jack Dempsey.
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
If you see this picture and you'll see some others, there was nothing about Babe's biceps and his arms that you'd go, oh my God. You know, he was sort of like an average-looking guy. Dempsey looked
Not for the
stronger than him.
chest. His chest was huge.
Chest was huge.
And
he swung a bat that no one today would swing, the weight of that bat. And yet he'd whip it around. And
One of the arguments that people have, and you some of you Yankee fans may remember that Adam Ottavino stupidly said before this season that he'd strike out Babe Ruth every time if he were pitching against him today. And baseball experts, batting experts, tell me that's nonsense. Babe Ruth had all the reflexes and all the ability to hit. All he would need is a 32-ounce bat, as opposed to the 54-ounce bat that he first started using. By later in his career, he was down to a more manageable 36 or 34-ounce bat, but Adam Ottavino wouldn't have had a chance. And Christy Walsh up in the corner is saying, "Look what I set up, the first meeting between the two big guys." And Christy Walsh sets up advertisements. He represented a guy named Ray McNamara, who was a car enthusiast and expert. So this is an early example of corporate synergy and marketing synergy. He's going to have Babe Ruth promote his other client, Ray McNamara's his columns in the sports pages about motoring tips, which to say the least Babe Ruth could use since he was known for driving cars into ditches repeatedly. And of course, he would later also endorse the car.
He was in an auto accident once where he was announced dead in the newspaper, right?
That was in Philadelphia early on, and his pal Charlie Leary, who was a first base coach for the Yankees, was in the car crash, as was Ruth's first wife. And he thought he'd killed Charlie Leary. But all Charlie Leary was upset about was that his hat came off because he was so bald that he hated being seen without it. This is taken, again, at the Polo Grounds in 1921. And it was a big series between the Yankees and the Cleveland Indians to determine the pennant. And how are you going to get information from the Polo Grounds? Well, there was no way. All you could do was wait for the afternoon paper to come out. And nobody in the Upper East Side wanted to wait. So this guy, Charles Farbizo, who had a going concern with pigeons, brought a pigeon to the Polo Grounds and sent it back and forth after each inning so that the residents of the Upper East Side could get updates. Now, this picture is taken a month after the first Major League Baseball game is broadcast on radio out of Pittsburgh with a very limited listening audience. But what's amazing about this is, so this is September 21. 1927, that World Series that they win 4 straight, is broadcast on 2 national radio networks. NBC, which went live on January 1st from the Waldorf Astoria, and CBS, which followed in the spring. So the revolution in technology, it was every bit as revolutionary a moment in technology then as the home computing that we've all gone through was for us. And it was so on opening day of 1927, first pregame show, Graham McNamee interviewing Babe Ruth from Yankee Stadium.
A little side note here, I started, as you heard, with the Yankees in 1968. So many people on the scene really went back to the 30s and 40s. It was a treat for me to meet all of them, the photographers, the journalists. And I learned that up until like 62 or 63, the Daily News still use homing pigeons to send their film back to 42nd Street to the Daily News building from Yankee Stadium.
Much faster than the traffic, yeah.
Yeah, the photographers would give the homing pigeons their rolls of film to fly back to 42nd Street.
And this year, just to let everybody come up to date, the Daily News fired its entire photo staff. The photo staff that invented the way to photograph live action sports is now no more.
The New York Times covered the Giants-Packers yesterday, but with Associated Press, they didn't send a reporter to New Jersey.
I wouldn't have covered that game either.
It's the Packers.
And my father, by the way, was a water boy for the 1927 New York Football Giants, because my grandfather, just so you know that I come from good stock, was a bookie and a rum runner, and he supplied all the booze to the polo grounds. And so as a thank you, they hired my father, little Morty, to be the water boy. Now you know everything about me, my deepest, darkest secrets. So Babe Ruth got married. He got married very young to a waitress from a coffee shop named Helen Woodford. And that's their daughter, Dorothy, whose parentage would remain a question of much doubt and gossip for her entire life. The thing that, again, is important about this is Babe Ruth back on the farm in Sudbury, Massachusetts, where Christy Walsh sent him after he got himself in big trouble during the 1922 season. So they set up this whole thing for Babe Ruth to go and be a family man, and then they would have photographers come and take family pictures. Babe Ruth actually spent very little of that winter there. He had a Packard, and he changed out the gasoline tank so that it could hold 55 gallons, so that he could drive back and forth from Sudbury to Manhattan without having to stop for gas. The thing about Helen, who would die tragically in a house fire in January 1929, though, is this: Babe Ruth, in the moment when he leaves St. Mary's in 1914, and he's signed to go off with the Orioles, in the next 8 months, he would sign his first professional contract, he would debut in the major leagues, and he would get married. So remember, this is the guy whose reputation is as a consummate womanizer and, degenerate, who was almost perceived to be animalistic in some ways. No. When he got out of St. Mary's, the first thing he did was try to give himself the family that he never had. One of his granddaughters said to me, he was a window wisher. He was a guy who would walk along a street, and he'd see a family at a dinner table talking and the drapes blowing in the wind, and he'd say, why didn't I have that? Well, the first thing he did was to try to recreate that. That it didn't last, that he didn't know how to be a husband or a father at age 19, is hardly surprising. But the touching thing to me was that is what he tried to do.
Now,
yes.
It turns out our time has flown very quickly.
Oh, shoot.
And if we stay on this pace, we'll never get finished. So I'm going to be quiet and let you run through the rest of the slideshow rapidly so that we kind of meet the requirements.
That's the second wife, the showgirl. And those two are pictures set up by Christy Walsh, and they're taken the day that the adoption of Dorothy, who is between Claire and Babe, is made legal, and at the same time, and Babe actually adopted Dorothy himself, which leads one to believe that she was not actually his biological daughter, as they claimed. So they adopted each other's children, and that's the happy picture that was put out. It was not a happy family, particularly for Dorothy. That's me and Julia on her 100th birthday. That's Babe Ruth in spring training in Alabama. One of the things about him was that everybody wanted a piece of Babe Ruth. Everybody loved Babe Ruth, and particularly African Americans. And that was partly due to the fact that that there were rumors that followed him throughout his career and his life that go back to St. Mary's, where he was known by a very ugly racial epithet. It's in the book, I guess I won't repeat it now. And so he was widely believed, based simply on stereotype of having a big nose and thick lips and darkly complected, that people thought he might be passing. And so one year when he was re-signed by the Yankees at the end of his career, and people thought they weren't going to re-sign him, the Amsterdam News ran a big headline, "Harlem rests at peace," because Babe Ruth had been re-signed. That is Babe Ruth with kids at a tubercular summer camp, kids in loincloths. And Babe Ruth is there with his, he wore Countess Mara clothes that Claire outfitted him with. He became quite stylish, but I don't know if you can see, again, the smile, but you know, somebody else might have been a little uncomfortable at the kids and their condition and their attire, not him. That's him with sports writers, fishing writers in San Diego, who reporters always found ways, particularly in the off season, this was in January, to take him out fishing or hunting. Because if they took him out fishing or hunting, they could write a story about him in the off season. He was the original reason for 24/7 coverage. And the original reporter was?
Marshall Hunt?
Marshall Hunt for the New York Daily News, whose beat was to cover Babe Ruth every day, 24/7, all year. And that's him resting up for the 1927 season. My mother would have said he was playing possum. He's not really asleep. And one of the things about Babe Ruth is he never sat still, ever. That's at the Del Coronado Hotel in San Diego. That's him leaving Hollywood after filming a movie en route back to New York to sign a contract to negotiate with Jake Rupert, where he was seriously outgunned in leverage and experience. And those were ladies of the evening who were hired to show up during the day to see him off at the station in Los Angeles. That's the beautiful swing. There you see how much he's rotated, how the arms and chest and hips have come all the way around. And that is the same kind of beautiful swing that you see today on the best hitters. That's in Chicago. That's Comiskey Field. Right, Marty?
Yeah, you can tell by the arch.
By the arch, right. And obviously he swung and missed. That's a PR poster that Walsh in the middle created for the 27 tour with the uniforms he created. Whoops. In addition to what he earned at each of the stops on the tour, he would occasionally stop and do a little extra negotiating on his own behalf. He got $3,000 for spending 10 minutes in a pair of overalls, the first product marketed in the United States, men's clothes that actually had a zipper. And it was known as the Whizzit, which I think does not require any comment. And this is Babe and Lou in Omaha. Again, an early example of corporate synergy. It was the National Egg Laying Contest, and this chicken was known originally as Lady Amco, because that was the name of the feed company, but she later became known because of her streak of laying an egg, one a day for 173 days, as the Babe Ruth of layers. So that's at the Amco company, and I'm gonna play this, even though it may, because it's worth it if it's gonna go. Oh, this was Nebraska needed to come up in the egg world a bit. It had been seriously outdone, particularly by Illinois and Missouri. So staging this event was very important. And there's she was originally Lady Norfolk, then she became Lady Amco, then she became the Babe Ruth of layers, and Babe's gonna meet her. And he and Lou are gonna do a hidden hidden egg trick right there. And they will give him her egg from that day. The president got the one that broke the world record of laying, but it arrived at the White House too late for it to be eaten, only because they had canceled the flight that used to go from New York to Washington. For some reason, they had just canceled that, and so the egg had to get on a train after it got to New York. And by the time it got to the White House, the mailroom had closed, and an an unchilled egg was not deemed okay for the president. Okay, this is in Sioux City at the home, a party at the home of the organizer of the game there, a guy named Jiggs Donahue and his brood of cowboys posing. And let's see if we can do this one. This is thanks to Mr. Raycraft, who allowed me to see this. He owns this footage.
We okay, Kirsten?
Yeah, we're all right? You guys all right? Okay. So they organize this party. This is before they go to the ballpark. And the mom, of who you will see in a minute, of young Jimmy on the horse, decides Jimmy's going to put on a show. The pony's name is Molly. And Molly was a champion, to say the least. Jimmy's going to show off his lasso expertise, and he's almost going to lasso Babe Ruth over here in a second. And Lou Gehrig, as everybody knows, never had any children, and there he is holding one of the youngest boys. This is Babe Ruth at his best. He was a consummate ham. But it gets worse.
Poor horse.
Poor Molly. I was able to speak to one of these kids.
Really?
Yeah. Oh. Nobody could tell me how Molly survived, but you'll notice that Gehrig goes over to the flank of the horse and stands there next. Now, this is Babe Ruth speaking to the guy who's filming this, and according to the man I hired who does lip reading.
Don't say it.
Should I not say it? Say it? Okay. He said to the guy who was filming, that's Christy Walsh, shut that fucking thing off. Christy Walsh was known for chewing gum a lot, which people took offense at. And, it's a garden party without any libations, and you can imagine Babe Ruth is not too happy about that. Now, I don't know, can I switch to, there's the mom, and then comes her sister. This is a big deal in Sioux City. Will this fast forward to the next one? Yeah, if you keep going. I'll try to see. Okay, then they go to Denver, where they're presented with headdresses. Ruth arranges for a spread of bison on the train. He wires ahead that he wants bison on the train for Lou, because Lou's never tried it. One of the things that's important about the tour is to remember is Gehrig was just 25 years old, and he had just won the Most Valuable Player award, which he won, just not Ruth, because you couldn't get it twice back in those days. And so Gehrig had a great season and chased him in the home run chase all across the American League. But this gave Christy Walsh an opportunity to present Babe Ruth and promote him as the wise elder who taught Lou how to behave in public, since Lou was such a shy, retiring guy and such a mama's boy, that the first thing he did at every hotel was sit down and write his mother, who was in the hospital at St. Vincent's having had goiter surgery. Now, this is Babe in San Francisco, and look at the size of his hands. When I started writing the Koufax book, people said to me, I would say, well, how did he throw the ball the way he did? And they said, have you shook his hand? And I go, no, not yet. Well, I shook his hand, and his hand, I'm not large, but his hand reached all the way up to here. Well, Babe Ruth's hands would have come up to here. And look at it, he's encircled this little boy, whose name is Jack Whitey Stewart, and he was the bat boy that day. And the reason that this is probably the best picture I have to show the sheer size of the guy. He was much bigger than the game. Most players were maybe 5'9", 5'10", if that. A lot of pitchers were like Spec Shea, 5'8", threw slop, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by putting mud or spit on a ball. Babe Ruth was literally bigger than everybody else. And Jack Whitey Stewart never had a day as good as this in his life. When he was buried and there was a wake for him, his jersey that he's wearing there was laid out in the coffin on top of him.
Look at those skinny legs on Babe.
Yeah, well, but his legs are only skinny in relation to how big the rest of him is. They weren't really that thin. Okay, this is from Stockton. This is footage that was just identified, joint effort by Tom Schieber, who's the great curator and at the Hall of Fame, and by me, because we figured out, nobody knew where this was from, but you'll see Babe Ruth take a swing in a minute and reach for his back. By this point of the barnstorming tour, and they did an exhibition, home run hitting exhibition for each game, his hands were bleeding and blistered, and his back, is gone. So they add a game the next day in Marysville, California, which was an old gold mining town named for one of the survivors of the Donner Party. And he goes there specifically to see a chiropractor who all the players in the PCL, Pacific Coast League, use. And he brought steak to breakfast. And, the kids were just flummoxed. They had never seen a steak before. He lived in another world. This is in Fresno, where he received a telegram asking him to do another theatrical tour that after they were done playing baseball. And he said, no way, I'm going to do a lot of hunting, fishing, and you know what, this off season. This is 2 weeks after he retired. And this is at a Westchester country club where he dresses up as an admiral in the Swiss Navy, get the joke, and plays in a softball game. Baseball had no place and no use for him once he retired. He always wanted, his wife said, to manage. I'm not sure how much he really wanted to be managed and how much he just wanted to be wanted, because the repudiation by the institution of baseball was every bit as big a loss as the repudiation by his birth family. And in fact, it was a recapitulation. And he would really, this is July 4th, 1935, they would never find something for him to do. And he would die basically a broken man. That's with Gehrig, the day Gehrig retired at Yankee Stadium, after a feud that was about his wife, Lou's wife, spending a day eating caviar and champagne in the Ruth stateroom aboard the Empress of Japan, en route to Japan in the fall of '34. Lou was a blushing bridegroom, and he couldn't find his wife Eleanor anywhere, and he thought maybe she'd gone overboard. So everybody, all the ship's mates and the captain were searching, scanning the horizon, when in fact she was getting sloshed with the Ruths. And he never talked to Babe Ruth again. That's 1947. It's his last Christmas. He's dying of nasopharyngeal cancer. It was not throat cancer. It was a cancer that grew in the nasal passages behind his nose, which was inoperable. They did have to tie off his carotid artery because it spread so widely. He did agree to an experimental brand of chemotherapy and radiation, first patient to do so, and it had a good effect for a period of time, so good that it was reported in the Wall Street Journal without his name attached to it as a breakthrough in cancer treatment. And while it's not used anymore today, it is the basis for the kind of treatment that is used today. And when people say he didn't know he was dying of cancer, he knew. In fact, Claire had told him, but he also knew what the treatment was for. And that's him on his last birthday, 53 years old, in Florida. He said, I don't have much longer to go, but I'm not gonna end up in here in the hospital. And he went down to Florida, and those are two boys he didn't know, Babe Ruth and the kids. and he shared his birthday cake with them. And that's him saying goodbye at Yankee Stadium. The farewell, the Yankees forgot to retire his number on Babe Ruth Day in April 1947, so they brought him back for the silver anniversary of the first Yankees World Championship, 1923. And this is, of course, the reverse of the famous picture that won a Pulitzer Prize taken by a Herald Tribune photographer, Nat Fine. But I like it for two reasons. It shows the enormity of the place and of his place in it, and also way, way, way deep in the right field behind one of those pillars was where my grandmother lived, in a building called the Yankee Arms.
And by the way, short little footnote, he never had the NY on his jersey as an active player with the Yankees. That didn't come along until 1936.
And now we can talk over this. This is footage nobody's ever seen. It was taken by the family, by a very wealthy car dealer who, people like to pay for Babe Ruth to have a good time. So he wanted to go fishing. They arranged a fishing expedition. This is going to run through, you're going to see that Babe Ruth catches 17 fish and eats 17 fish. And he enjoys himself so much that he's too late to get back to San Diego, where he's supposed to have his last performance of his barnstorming tour, so they have to call in a daredevil pilot to fly him back there. And Babe Ruth, in his drunken state, sticks his elbow through the they used canvas or something for the sides of the planes then. So they patched it with Pillsbury baking stuff from one of the sacks of flour. So that's the car owner guy. And this is going to run through, and you're going to get to a point where they're on a hunting trip. If I can stop it there, I will. But in the meantime, does anybody have a quick question? Because this runs a little bit.
We can also do questions during the book signing, so I just wanted to say that. And we have.
I just wanted to ask you about the paternity issue, whether there's ever been DNA testing to try and figure out the answer
About
to that
Dorothy's
question.
parentage?
Yeah.
Dorothy was introduced to the public in the fall, September 1922, at the age of 16 months. And what caused there to be some doubt about that was that Babe said she was born at Columbia Presbyterian. Helen said, no, it was St. Vincent's. He said it was June. She said it was February. So from the get-go, there was lots of doubt about it. He never gave her answers to the questions that she asked. I have made such an attempt. I do not have the results yet.
Well, thank you so much.